Let's talk about hormones. This is a list of some of the general characteristics of these chemical messengers. In general, they are highly potent, and because of that, they are needed in very small amounts. We've already discussed how the endocrine system produces long-lasting effects. So sure enough, hormones are going to produce long-lasting effects in their target cells. And they will act relatively slowly. They will regulate or play a role in regulating virtually every metabolic process in the body. Please remember forever that most of them are going to function through negative feedback systems. We have two types: the cholesterol-based or steroidal hormones, or the nonsteroidal hormones, which are water-soluble and are either amino acids or peptide-based hormones. So we just categorize them into protein-based or amino acid-based hormones to keep it simple for this class. These hormones will either circulate freely in the circulatory system, they don't last a very long time, or they will be attached to a carrier protein, and those are going to be the steroidal hormones. Those are going to be the cholesterol-based ones. Let's talk about those first. All steroidal hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. Cholesterol gets a bad rap when it comes to diet. You need to remember that 80% of the cholesterol in your body is made by your liver. And you also need to remember this, that your consumption of cholesterol really does not play much of a role in your cardiovascular health. We'll talk more about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. Steroidal hormones have to bind to transport proteins. And because of that, they are able to remain in the circulatory system longer than the nonsteroidal hormones. They will be produced and secreted by reproductive organs, the adrenal cortex, and the kidneys. They have a pretty easy life and are able to pass easily through the cell membrane. And because of that, that means their receptors will either be within the cytoplasm or within the nucleus. And because you know all about the phospholipid bilayer, that's the hint, you will be able to tell me and understand why they can pass easily through a cell membrane. They're pretty complex lipids. We know, once again, hint, hint, you should know this, they're going to be able to pass pretty easily through that phospholipid bilayer. We know that the receptors are either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. They have to be within the cell. And the complex actually may bind directly with DNA, which means it can activate or deactivate genes. So I want you to think about this, because we talked about genes and what genes are for way back when we talked about cells. What are they actually affecting if they are activating or deactivating genes? You will be able to figure out the answer. And if not, remind me in class and we'll go over it. We're going to switch over to the non-steroidal hormones. So they are either peptide hormones or amino acid derivatives. So we kind of categorize them as sort of protein-based hormones, just to keep things simple. The peptide hormones are usually synthesized as these prohormones, which are actually inactive and convert to an active form either just before or just after they're secreted by the endocrine gland. They require a receptor on the target cell, which will allow that hormone to do one of two things: enter the cell. How can it enter a cell? How can a protein be moved or transported across the cell membrane? Or they will trigger the use of a second messenger. So What does that mean? I'm going to go back here. Now, if they're going to trigger the use of a second messenger, that means they're going to attach to a receptor on the cell membrane and trigger a cascade of events, and that's what you need to know. They're going to trigger a cascade of events, which in turn will cause a second messenger to be activated and basically do the job of that hormone. More on that shortly. So just the classes of the nonsteroidal hormones, there are amines, you know, they're going to be made up of amino acids because of its name. They will include hormones that are released, secreted, produced and secreted, spit that out, by the posterior pituitary. Some of the hormones produced and released by the hypothalamus will be nonsteroidal hormones. Epinephrine and non-epinephrine are nonsteroidal hormones, and so is PTH, which is parathyroid hormone, GH, which is growth hormone, and so are the hormones of the anterior pituitary. The other type of nonsteroidal hormones are prostaglandins, and those are going to be paracrine substances. Remember that paracrine substances have a relatively local effect. Prostaglandins are associated with an inflammatory response. So let's get back to how nonsteroidal hormones work. They have to either pass through a cell membrane using some sort of carrier mechanism, transport channel or transport carrier, transport protein, or, heads up, they will combine with specific receptors on the target cell's membrane. They form a thing called a hormone receptor complex on the cell membrane, which will form what's known as the first messenger. That's going to activate this G protein, which will in turn activate cyclic AMP in the cell. Nice to know. What you need to know is that complex, that hormone receptor complex, will start a cascade of biochemical reactions within the cell, which will trigger the use of second messengers within the cell. See how that's bolded? You need to know that second messengers are within the cell. Because that hormone receptor complex is hanging out on that cell membrane, you can actually trigger a lot of second messengers. So you can have a dozen, several hundred, maybe a couple of thousand of second messengers going off and doing the bidding of that nonsteroidal hormone, which is part of that hormone receptor complex on the cell membrane. And that is amplification. You have one hormone that binds to the receptor on a cell membrane, and it triggers the use of multiple second messengers. That's amplification. So a couple of things. If you hear this, the hormone binds with a receptor within the cell or within the cell's nucleus, by definition, it has to be a steroidal hormone. If you hear the term second messenger or amplification, you are talking about nonsteroidal hormones because they are two very different mechanisms of action. So make sure you understand the difference. So this little video up here, this mechanisms, ooh, you can hear this, the mechanisms of hormone action, is brief, and it gives you a nice little overview of what happens with steroidal versus non-steroidal hormones. And I would watch that for reinforcement. The Khan Academy video is more detailed, and if you want more information, have at it and have fun. So, what do they do? We're talking about hormones. Why do we care? What do they do? They can actually modify the structure or biochemical properties of cells or tissues. They can impact the metabolic activities of multiple tissues and multiple organs at the same time. Because remember, you have a whole bunch of hormones floating around in your circulatory system, and individual hormones can attach to receptors on individual cells in different places and trigger reactions and biochemical events. Many of the structures or organs of the body have endocrine-like functions and will produce and secrete specific hormones. Never forget that. It is not only the endocrine glands that produce and secrete hormones. Many structures or organs in the body do so. And in fact, we're going to be talking about some of the hormones that are produced and secreted by digestive tract organs. So they have endocrine-like functionality. This shows you examples, selected examples, not just examples, but selected examples of hormones that are going to be produced by organs that aren't endocrine glands. So adipose tissue, the stomach, the duodenum, which is the very first part of the small intestine. The heart produces the atrial natriuretic hormone, peptide, kidney, skeleton, skin, and thymus. We'll talk about the thymus as part of the endocrine system, though. Now, how do we control the secretion of hormones? There are going to be three ways. What makes us release them? They can be triggered by what's known as humoral stimulus, which is basically there's going to be some sort of change in an ion concentration or composition of the extracellular fluid, say in the plasma. And the concentration changes are of really critical ions or nutrients. So for example, think calcium. You have calcium ions floating around in your plasma. They're in the plasma, and when you have insufficient calcium or too much calcium, you're going to trigger the release of various hormones. Or you can actually have hormones triggering the release or inhibition of other hormones. And when you think about that, the hypothalamus is going to produce a series of hormones which will target the anterior pituitary and either direct the anterior pituitary to produce more of a hormone or to stop producing hormones. And in addition, there might be neural stimulation. So direct connect by neurons from the nervous system to a gland, and a classic example of that is the adrenal gland. Remember that most hormone secretion will be triggered or controlled by negative feedback systems. The next slide shows you diagrams of examples of each of these: humoral stimulation, neural stimulation, or hormonal stimulation.